welcome to episode 2 of Liminal Frames. I am your co-host Nathan, and I'm here with my other co-host, ExoAcademian. Exo, how's it going?
It's going great. Had a great time on our first episode. Looking forward to digging in deeper on episode 2.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were incredibly pleased with the response to episode 1. In fact, I myself, when we finished it, I just couldn't wait to have the second conversation. So I'm glad we're finally here able to do this. But Exo, what were some of your reactions to some of the feedback that we got? And overall, how did you feel about that first episode?
Yeah, it's great because, you and I just enjoy talking about this stuff. It feels rewarding to have someone you can talk to about this and process thoughts and bounce ideas off of each other. We do that naturally already. So to be able to find that resonates with people was really great. That's really compelling. That shows that these things are interesting to a lot of people. And yeah, it was pretty mind blowing how positive the response was. I had a sense that shifting from just doing point of convergence, where it's more of like an essay that I kind of present with ideas, and making this more of a conversation. And while you and I always block out a few things we're going to talk about, it just quickly falls into, a back and forth and a real dialogue. And I think people have felt like they're right there with us in the room, and it's been compelling and resonating for them.
Yeah, absolutely. The flow is key here, and I think we've had a very strong flow from the very beginning. Well, let's jump right into the episode today and what we're going to talk about. So in episode 1, we really took kind of a big picture view and examined some of the things that we wanted to try to accomplish with liminal frames and talk about our own sort of journeys. But in episode 2, we're actually going to bring that down to a very specific place and examine the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So we're going to spend some time talking about that on the show and exploring what resonates with each of us in that hypothesis, what doesn't, and as well as some other landscapes that hypothesis, I think, opens up within the topic of the phenomenon. So Exo, if you want to kick it off for us, what are your kind of thoughts about this ETH? What's compelling to you when you think about it? What places does it take you? And what is your history with that hypothesis generally? I mean, did you jump right into that when you first started getting into the phenomenon, or did you come across it later in your journey?
Right. Well, what's interesting about the ETH, I think, with any of these hypotheses that we're going to discuss, actually, is that they're always bound within a cultural context, right? So it's not like someone just reached into a bag and pulled one out and said, "Hey, how about this idea?" No, you sort of have this evolving notion of what is the final frontier in every culture, right? So this whole idea of the Wild West became a big meme for American culture, right? When the Europeans came over, populated the East, and slowly the wild terrain of the West got tamed over time. That's sort of the mentality, right? That becomes a meme. Mm-hmm. Well, in the same way, once we had, human beings were on every continent on the earth, and we felt like we had a good understanding of place when it comes to our world. Then the next logical extension of what the final frontier was outer space. And so, and that culminated to some degree during the Cold War with the race to get to space and get to the moon and all that kind of stuff. And sort of this sort of egoic kind of push to like be the first one there, put a flag on the moon surface kind of thing. When we think about the others and this idea of a non-human intelligence interacting with us, from the get-go, people's first inclination is going to be, if it's not from here, then the only other option outside of sort of the spiritual domain. But when it looks like it's manifesting as a technological device, specifically with the early UFO sightings, and it looks like it's technology that's too advanced for human civilization at the time, the logical conclusion is these are from outer space, and at the time it's not just outer space like Alpha Centauri. It's Alpha Centauri. Mm-hmm. It's like these are Martians or Venetians, right? Like we go next door, right? We think, well, the world has a bunch of intelligent. That's arguable, but you know what I mean. Intelligent creatures. So why wouldn't Mars and Venus and Saturn and Jupiter? So all this thing we didn't really understand yet how unique the Earth was in terms of the other planets of our solar system. So the assumption is, the Martians are here, right? Even to the point where you can have a radio play about Martians attacking, and people suddenly panic and wonder if this is really going on, because it's already in the expectation of the culture, right? That there's that idea has already been seeded in the culture, in the background of our minds. Mm. So that's the first thing I would say about the ETH is you can't think about this historically without realizing where we were as a culture and what our sense of this, what the final frontier was. And then when, starting with Kenneth Arnold and whatnot, sort of the dawn of the, the first flying saucer era, right? Mm-hmm. That's when that term was first coined. When you see these things flying in formation that look like physical objects, right? Not, the whole orb thing kind of came later, right. Or at least the discussion of it did, even though apparently even Kenneth Arnold apparently had interactions with orbs after that, which is fascinating in itself. Mm-hmm. But at the time, all that was talked about was, okay, these are physical, technological objects. Therefore, the logical assumption is these are coming from outer space. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny. You started out exactly with where my mind went to it, and that is that the worldviews that we inherit and that you can look at through our history very much lended to the easy adoption of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's a natural stepping stone from our sort of history as folks that were pretty tribal, and then lived in states, and then lived on continents, and then empires, and all. And as those empires expanded, there are new frontiers that we arrive at, and so it's not too hard to then take that jump once we confirm in our consensus reality that we're on a planet that is in this solar system, that there may also be other things on other planets in our solar system. So it's a very I think it's a very natural progression of a theory when we're talking about the phenomenon itself. But what's interesting to me about that as well is that it's very attractive. It's not only that it's naturally compelling, but it's also kind of very romantic. And so, and when I talk about that, let's talk a little bit about kind of the way in which our culture and our science fiction in particular have kind of elevated this concept to a very romantic notion of kind of, I think here of Star Trek or Star Wars, very popular kinds of things, where you have entities from other planets in other solar systems, other galaxies, and they're interacting with each other. But they're, interestingly enough, they're interacting in a very, sort of human structure, right? Where they have ships of their own. We have ships. There's a governance. There are common laws that are at place. The atmospheres all seem to be pretty much similarly breathable. So it's a very easy way, I think, to think about this. And there's something to the comfort of the idea itself that lends to its popularity, right? So it's not too hard of a leap for anyone to go there, and that makes it attractive and also helps it to spread as a pretty common hypothesis. So for me, it's definitely something that in my own history, with not just like an intense interest in the phenomenon, but just as a person in growing up in 20th century and 21st century America, it was a very kind of compelling, attractive, fun in a way, hypothesis and a way to think about our place in relationship to the vast universe. I don't know if you had some sort of similar feelings about it as well, just kind of from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah, and I think you made a really good point about the sense of we-ness that expands into greater circles, but also the sense of otherness, right? How we define otherness, like you said, that we go from sort of families to tribes to nation states to, sort of global pacts kind of thing, with a couple of different adversarial sides. Eventually you get more of a globalist kind of perspective. And then the natural inclination after that is that the only otherness left is out there, right? Mm-hmm. And then you add to that we all, as children, look up at the night sky and see this great expanse, and we try and wrap our heads around how far away those stars are, and that actually we're seeing a snapshot of a star from like 1 million years ago, because it's taken that long for the light to get here. And wrapping your head around, like seeing an example of general relativity right in front of your eyes in real time is so bizarre. And And like you said too, when we started imagining what those others were like, you have on the one hand, you have something like Star Trek, which you brought up, which is kind of more of a positive mentality of like the scientific expedition, not going to plunder other places, but to go and explore and to greet and to meet new beings, and the prime directive, right? Like, don't interfere with that culture. Just go and observe. It's a very positive, kind of scientific, progressive kind of view. And like you say, the irony is that Star Trek would often use certain disruptions or conflicts going on in human culture and then reflect that in what was happening in some alien culture, right? So really we were discussing our own societies kind of wrestling with different issues and then projecting it onto that, which there's a lot of that. That's the key, is the projecting, right? So that's the sort of more positive view, which, like, as you pointed out, it's still very much projecting a human psychology onto these aliens most of the time. But then you have like the Independence Day kind of, other side, Hollywood side, where these others are coming to plunder us, right? So, and we're seen as kind of like an inconvenient, obstacle to them getting resources or taking over the planet. They prefer palm trees to desert sand or something. And so that's been drilled into our head too, over and over again. You can't be raised in Western civilization and not be aware of all these backdrops of movies that depict these others as kind of plundering invaders, who see us as enemies. And that's very much, again, kind of maybe to some degree our repressed guilt around the fact that maybe as European societies, we went and plundered other, continents. So we sort of project that onto them again. So when people do start hearing about the possibility of UFOs and aliens in the real world, they inevitably have these subconscious associations rise up, right? And to some degree, fear sometimes rises up. Now, maybe if they saw Star Trek, more often they have more of a positive view. But if they saw Independence Day, they go, "Oh man, we how are we going to deal with these guys?" And if there is evidence, as there seems to be, that they show some degree of technological sophistication beyond us, then we get really nervous because we don't think we can, win that dogfight kind of thing.
That's right.
So all of that is part of the cultural stew.
Yeah. As you were talking, it made me think as well how that hypothesis probably helped push our science to a certain degree. Because when you talk about the vast distances that are at play at the universe, one of the sort of benefits of this hypothesis is that it really serves as a shrinking, reducing valve for the vast, quantities that we cannot really comprehend. Right. So by personalizing it and kind of anthropomorphizing other beings, just like us on other planets and other universes, it shrinks those distances down to something that might be plausible. We can actually maybe interact. Well, how would we do that? It doesn't seem like it's achievable via the physics that we have discovered. And so therefore there must be other physics yet to be discovered to help us bridge that divide. And so that drives our scientific discovery to places that it may not have otherwise gone. And that's an interesting byproduct because it's just an idea. It's not even, arguably it's not necessarily something that we have all agreed to is a real thing. It is an idea that many of us find compelling, but most of us don't spend, and I say most of us on the earth don't spend a ton of time thinking about it. But it is the power of the idea itself that I think drives our discovery and leads us onto new pathways that we really weren't planning to tread at all. So it's funny how these things kind of start out as I think easy conclusions, but they end up opening up doors to a whole bunch of other areas and aspects that weren't initially present to us. But I also wanted to comment on the fact that you did talk about the kind of the negative aspects of it, and it's funny how both the positive and the negative are very compelling in their own right. So they each kind of serve as catalysts for change, but just change of a different order. In the positive environments, ironically, the human cultures can be a little bit more divisive, because we don't necessarily have to be united as a front to combat these threatening beings. But in the threatening paradigm, we actually have to be united as a planet in order to beat back against the threatening other alien. So it's a funny, like, on the peaceful side, it actually allows us to be a little bit more confrontational, with interspecies. But on the danger side, it allows us to rise together and unite as one to overcome this extreme obstacle.
Yeah, and ironically, historically, there was a speech that Ronald Reagan gave sort of at the height of the Cold War, not at the height, but, still when the Cold War was plenty hot, where he said that very thing, that ironically, the one thing that we would unite the world, even in the midst of a Cold War and the potential for destroying ourselves, mutually assured destruction because of all the nuclear weapons pointed at each other, the one thing that would override that paradigm and change the narrative enough to us to completely change our approach would be an extraterrestrial threat, Right. And then, of course, there's been all sorts of, speculation since then. Was he hinting at something really going on, or is he just speaking a hypothetical? But
Right.
Even if it was just a hypothetical, it's a point well taken.
Absolutely.
And I also wanted to comment too on what you said about
Sure.
how we've expanded the boundaries too. So, like I said, in the early 20th century, the notion was, let's be prepared to greet the Martians and the Venetians, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then, as we've learned more and more about the apparent barrenness of the other planets in our solar system, like you said, that pushes our technology, and we have to then dream up ways of, how do we get to the next solar system?
Mm-hmm.
When suddenly the distances are so vast that you're talking about either taking many, many generations to get there, or you have to completely reinvent the way that travel works, and completely reinvent paradigms. And then even something like SETI, many people would argue that the way that we're trying to broadcast ourselves or detect other civilizations with radio signals and whatnot is kind of preposterous and hilarious, because speaking again of cultural frames, it was born at a time when we thought radio signals were the bomb. That's the way that was cutting edge for us at the time. And so we thought, yeah, radio signals. We'll look for their radio signals. And then within a decade or two, even that short a time frame, we realized, no, wait a second. Any civilization beyond what was the 1960s or 70s to us is going to be well beyond radio signals. And that's not a great way to try and pick up these others. So it's interesting how it has pushed our technology, and how sometimes we're so, short-sighted in terms of how we think about how these others would show up or how we would even detect them.
Yeah, for sure. And what, we've spoken, I think, a good bit on the sort of general contours of the theory, but, I know on your own podcast, you spent some time looking at some specific cases that have tended to trend toward that hypothesis. So are there any cases that come to mind for you that really read on the surface as extraterrestrial hypothesis, and what is compelling about that?
You mean cases where I really do believe ETH is the best fit?
Where either you do or those who hear of that case come away thinking that's the easiest and best conclusion to take away from?
Right. That's a good question. And I guess I don't usually think about it in those terms. What I tend to think about is that logically, there's no reason why ETs couldn't have been here by now. Like when I think about the age of the universe, and how there are some civilizations that could be millions of years, hundreds of millions, years older than ours, to the point where, as Arthur C. Clarke pointed out, any sufficiently sophisticated technology is going to appear like magic, indistinguishable from magic to a lesser civilization. So all of these things that to us seem like big deals, like, oh, how do you get past those interstellar distances? They're so vast, right? And I think and I've used this term, I think it's hilarious when in, the 2020s now, we go, well, yeah, I just don't think it's likely because the distances are just too vast. And again, we make that same radio signal mistake, right? We say, for us right now in this snapshot of 2022, we can't overcome that, at
Right.
least in the next decade or so. So we project that onto every civilization that might exist that even might be, hundreds of millions of years older than ours. And we think about how we've gone from a horse and buggy to spacecraft that have now, probes that have left our solar system or not. Yeah, our solar system now
Hmm.
in the space of like what 150 years or something. I mean, that's such a tiny snapshot, and that we have enough hubris to assume that no other civilization will have been able to conquer, the vastness of space yet. Even when
Right.
we know things like wormholes exist, at least theoretically, and there's even discussions now about how you would harness that and try and hold them open long enough and stabilize them. So, so I think about it more in those terms. I go, there's no reason why they wouldn't potentially have come here. I
Hmm.
think that we are definitely not secretive about our existence on the earth. We have all sorts of ways that we are broadcasting ourselves, not just deliberately, but I mean, even just with our technology.
Mm.
And you think about how much space junk there is orbiting our planet now. So it would not be difficult for a more advanced species to detect that we are here. And
Hmm.
if they have the same spirit of, kind of curiosity that we have, it would not be a stretch to imagine they've come here. So there are some cases that I don't see why they couldn't be ETH. And I think as a general rule, it makes sense that they could be in the picture. And so that tends to be my response to all these different hypotheses. I
Sure.
very rarely say absolute no to any of them, because if it's reasonable that it could be in the picture, I often think it is. And when we don't know the parameters of how old these civilizations might be, I mean, conceivably, they could be much, much, much older. In fact, they could be so old and so much more advanced that they might have, departed into some sort of hyperspace. And that's why we don't pick them up, right? There's so many options.
Mm.
And they might be observing us and interacting with us from some higher dimensional plane that's like a hyperspace, but they're still ETs. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
in terms of their original origin. So
Right.
that's where it gets complicated. So do I think to some degree that extraterrestrial others in some way are in the picture? Yes. I just think it gets complicated when you try and sort that all out. What do you think?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that there are some stories in ufology that when you're new to the topic, read on the surface level very much as extraterrestrial hypothesis stories. I mean, Roswell, perfect example, right?
Right.
Happened in the late 40s. Supposedly a crashed craft and bodies that were retrieved. And the easiest conclusion at the time, and even looking back, is to say, yeah, that's just some intergalactic kind of tourist that just happened to had to have a bad day and crashed in New Mexico. So, that is I think kind of a very easy conclusion, surface level way to read that. And there are many others like that story that read on the surface as an extraterrestrial hypothesis. The other thing about the way that stories are read, and I struggle with this quite a bit myself in the time that I've spent with the topic, is that you can go through so many different landscapes and theories about what it is that oftentimes I kind of find myself going, all right, what is the simpler explanation? I've kind of been able to spin out a bunch of complex explanations, and in a way, we're attracted to the even more complex theories because it's like, that's kind of it really lights the brain on fire there. That's something I hadn't considered, and so it's new and it's novel. I'm going to pursue that new track and discard this other stuff. But oftentimes, the novel theories that we entertain are far more complex. And so, to use the old adage of keep it simple, stupid, I tend to go back and go, well, maybe what if it is just ETH? What if it's just extraterrestrial? And we've kind of layered onto that all these other sort of theories that may not fit that simple interpretation. And so, it's I know it's never that easy. I kind of wish that it were because it's very elegant and it's just, again, it kind of touching back to what we talked about earlier. It has this romantic idea. We could have a relationship with the beings that would be similar to relationships that we enter into in human culture, and we could forge. We could trade, we could learn things. It would be this really exciting new way for us to expand our civilization and our science and our awareness of our place in the universe. But at the same time, I think the more that you look at it, the more you realize, it just, the simplicity, it's too alluring. There's something else there, and we probably do need to give credence to some of the other theories that are floating around.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Even when you brought up the example of Roswell, I agree with you that on the face of it, it's easy to conclude this looks like ETs who've traveled here, and like you said, they had a bad day. But then one of the first arguments that came up was, okay, so you're telling me they've managed to travel across vast solar systems, intergalactic travel potentially, and then they crash in the desert, like they don't know how to handle the atmosphere of our planet, like that feels like a stretch to people, which then sort of like breeds these whole notions, like this deep-seated like secret psychological ploy, like maybe they're trying to give us some sort of coded message in crashing, right? Which on the one hand, I understand that point of view, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, like you brought up Roswell, and you have the whole thing, with Trinity and the book by Vallée and Harris, where, it's so closely tied to the atomic bomb detonation and a major change in the sort of the fabric of human society and adversarial relationships amongst different civilizations, that makes people wonder, wow, that's weird how that happened at the same time. What's that about? The big increase around the dawn of the atomic age is just really interesting. Whatever conclusion you come to, it's something you have to wrestle with at least. But it is interesting how even in those cases that look cut and dried, like, yeah, ETH should fit there, there's often these extra bits of data that don't seem to fit. Like, for instance, I brought up the Kenneth Arnold piece.
Yeah.
And I think this only came up recently. I certainly only became aware of it more recently, that this guy who saw, in Oregon, saw these saucers flying in formation, later in that week, apparently saw orbs in his hallway, so this is what leads us to sort of the next part of the conversation, that so many of the cases involved elements of high strangeness, right? And this is what people like Vallée and Hynek, who were the original proponents of the ETH, right? When Vallée was young and was working, tracking satellites and whatnot in space, working for an astronomical outfit in France, I think it was. And he observed some weird anomalies, and he tried to bring it to the attention of the director. And the guy basically said, let's get rid of those tapes. Like, they just didn't want to. And that first shocked Vallée into this notion that, wait a second, you mean we're seeing stuff that we can't account for, and we're actually not just not paying attention, but we're potentially covering it up? Why is that happening? What's this about? So he really began to go, okay, sure, it looks like ETs to me. I mean, that doesn't fall within the parameters of something we would have up there, so it must be ETs, right? So he started looking into it, turned into an obsession for him, like so many of us. And when he partnered with J. Allen Hynek for a period of his career, and then later on, even independently, they both came to the conclusion that there was so much high strangeness involved that perhaps the ETH wasn't the best way to make sense of all of the data. And they were the leading, investigators, researchers of their time. They were the ones that were going to the actual sites of the sightings and the interactions, right? Because now we get into the whole thing about how human beings were contacted and affected by these interactions, whether it's just by something they saw or an interaction with what appears to be non-human intelligence, and how they were changed. People like Hynek and Vallée were on site. They, looked at soil samples. They looked at radiation burns. They looked at manifestations in the physical environment. And just as importantly, they interviewed at length the contactees, the experiencers, the people who observed these things, and noticed profound and lasting changes in them that, again, seemed to go beyond, or at least it made more complicated. If these are ETs, how is it impacting these people in these ways? And the ways that these craft would sort of pop in and pop out of our reality, it's not like they were like, oh, look, we're tracking it. It's just past Mars now, and here it comes. It's coming in at this trajectory. It's coming in. It's going to come over Greenland.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like that, right? Like they just would pop in, to our reality, like jumping from one frame to another. Just suddenly they're there, and just as easily they pop out. So all of these elements together led these, world-renowned researchers who are at the top of their field to say, wait a second, as much as we were proponents that this is a simple case of ETs coming from other parts of the galaxy or beyond, that doesn't seem to fit. And the last thing I'll just point out too is that part of the hubris too, if you try and take sort of a really traditional view of the ETH, is that it assumes that even if they're sophisticated enough to get here, that their fundamental relationship with space-time hasn't changed. And that's a lot to swallow. That if they're potentially millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years ahead of us, surely their very fundamental relationship with space-time would be very different. So again, like I was saying before, they could still be ETs in the pure sense of the meaning they're beyond the Earth. They're coming from somewhere beyond the Earth, even within a physical plane. But how they get here, what their relationship to space-time is, all of that suddenly asks some much bigger questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that those researchers who spent so much time immersed in the topic, it's not like one day they just kind of woke up and said, we're bored with this idea. Let's just spin out some new fancy theories and say, that's what we should look at next. I think we needed to take it very seriously that the data that they spent so much time poring over and trying to make sense of compelled them to entertain new hypotheses. And so that really allows us to turn to what some of those other hypotheses might be. And, I think it's interesting as we turn to this, because we're now in an age in the 21st century where our science is kind of peeling back some of the layers of our understanding of our reality in ways that introduce sort of new models, new conceptions of what might be going on. And one of those sort of conceptions that has brought forth a new theory is the interdimensional hypothesis. So not thinking of the world that you and I inhabit as just the only kind of plane that there is, but that there are other lower and higher dimensions of reality that exist where life could be present. And just because we are not beings that inhabit those dimensions or perceive them, maybe the better word, doesn't mean that they don't exist. And as I thought about the interdimensional hypothesis earlier today, it's funny too that we have a very sort of anthropocentric notion about life in the universe. We with the Fermi paradox, we get quite frustrated. It doesn't make any sense. Where is the life? Because we presume that life in the universe will look like life as we understand it. It could actually be that the life that is here on the Earth is actually the rarity, like that life is abundant in the universe, but exists in ways that are nothing like the life that we understand. And
Right.
so, that could present itself in a whole sort of multitude of ways. But with the interdimensional hypothesis, the fact that you, as you mentioned, kind of craft that kind of blip in and out of our reality, of our perceived reality, that I think led them down that path to entertain that notion. What's compelling to you about the interdimensional way of looking at this issue?
Right. Well, the first thing I would want to point out, and you kind of hinted at it there, going back to what we began with in this conversation, saying that, cultural templates and the cultural context kind of set the table for the possibilities. Like you said, it was as notions like the multiverse were proposed by physics, right? When people looking at a model of reality said, wait a second, it may be that there's, like you pointed out, multiple parallel realities existing right alongside of each other, separated by the thinnest membranes, and yet they might as well be the other ends of the cosmos because they feel far away from us. We don't know yet how to interact with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about spatial distance. It's more of a frequency or a dimensional difference, right? And so that's when we come up with these terms like dimensions. And the fact that, in terms of what's compelling to me about it, one thing I would say is that there are the observations, like how they blip in and blip out, like you said, that seems to hint at something like that possibility. Combine that with the fact that we now expect that there could very well be parallel Earths and parallel universes. And then also you tie in how so many of the beings encountered, as well as the technology on display with the craft, kind of look like next gen human craft, and
Yeah.
the beings often look either humanoid or at least bipedal, right? They don't often come out and crawl out like octopi, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like they look bipedal, they look kind of like something like the creatures you'd see in Star Trek, right? Or at
Yep.
the bar in Star Wars. So that suggests some sort of connection to the earth, right? So either they're really good at hiding, and that's where you come up with some of the crypto-terrestrial kind of notion that what if they're living in the caverns of the earth, or they are living in the oceans or whatever. But if we haven't just missed them in our physical reality, then perhaps they're right next door but in a different dimension, and perhaps have followed a different evolutionary trajectory, but they still have some of the same basic ingredients, that they are connected to the earth in some way, even if the evolutionary trends shifted at some point. That explains why they look so much like either like us or like beings that seem to have evolved in an environment so similar to the earth. Because again, when you look at creatures that have certain physiology, it's according to our understanding of evolution, it's because life develops responses to enable survival, right? So it's better suited for the environment it evolves within. So you'd have to either posit that they just happen to come from planets in some far-flung star system that are awfully like the Earth. And when you start, and even what we know now about all the exoplanets that exist out there, there are some that are like the Earth, but that is definitely the minority. The vast majority are not like that. Whether they're gas giants or whatever. That if life were to evolve in any of those other planets, it wouldn't look anything like us.
Right.
And so when you look at the fact that they seem to look often humanoid or bipedal or whatever, or they would have respiratory systems similar to an oxygenated planet, those kind of things, then you start saying, okay, so when we combine all these elements, maybe interdimensional makes sense. It makes sense in how they're coming in and how they're going out. It makes sense how they seem to have connections to the earth, and yet we don't see them here. I think all those things become compelling about that hypothesis.
Yeah, for sure. Also, their ability to kind of be anywhere at any time. It's not just they can pop in and out of our atmosphere, but they seem to just so easily show up at any place. They could and also move through the physical environments that you and I inhabit. There are plenty of accounts where these beings, these others, can move through walls. Do things that our bodies cannot do, seemingly cannot do, and so it's not too hard of a jump to then say, well, this is just this is how we perceive them. To us, it looks like they're passing through the wall, but because they occupy a higher dimensional space, what they really look like is something else. And when they just intersect with our perception of our 3D, 4D space, that's how it shows up for us. So I think it does help. It does become, you can see how it becomes a better fit hypothesis in many ways than the original extraterrestrial hypothesis. It builds upon that idea, but then adds to it, and again, we've touched on this before, but it adds to it aspects of our understanding of the universe as that understanding expands. As we build on our science, it incorporates those new understandings and ultimately serves as a better fit model than the extraterrestrial hypothesis does at the start. And I think that overall, that's a concept that I think you and I, we've talked about a bunch. We're going to come back to this quite frequently, that whatever model that we end up landing on, the model needs to do a good job of fitting the majority, if not all, of what is accounted for in the experiences. And so this one certainly seems to be a better, more inclusive conclusion than the prior one.
That's very true. I also think, though, that part of this comes down to, again, speaking of cultural expectations and cultural templates and cultural contexts, I think it's easy to run into confirmation bias where you find what you expect to find because you happen to be looking for it. So
Mm.
the same way that the ETH seemed very intuitive, it seemed like the obvious response. The slowly even now. The general public is still catching up with the IDH, and that'll be an interesting thing for us to talk about in a second. Is the difference between those of us who are obsessed with this topic, where we're at with it, versus what the general public is ready to hear,
Hmm.
and where Congress is and all that. But I mean, again, in the early 20th century, middle 20th century, even into like the 70s or so, the ETH just seemed obvious. It wasn't even really a discussion at that point, right? It's like there was no notion yet in popular culture, even in ufology, really about many worlds hypothesis and the multiverse. So it just seemed obvious. And like you said, because of the sheer expanse of space and how many planets there are. And that's one of the really interesting things in the midst of this shift towards the interdimensional. At the same time, we have become more and more aware of just how many planets there are.
Mm.
Even, those Goldilocks zone planets that supposedly could host life, even as we do, like you pointed out already, kind of have a prejudice towards a certain kind of life.
Hmm.
But even when you take into account that prejudice, there should be plenty of planets with the, dizzying array, myriad planets across the vastness of space. And that's just the known universe. There's many, many, many millions that, could fit life, even as we sort of narrowly define it. So
Yeah.
that is interesting in itself. And again, that's why I don't reject the ETH at all. And when I look at that, and I laugh at the notion that they couldn't figure out how to get here, I think that would be a cakewalk eventually, right? I
Right.
think for us, it'll be a cakewalk within a couple hundred years, if not less.
Hmm.
So give me a million years, and I'm pretty confident they can figure that out. So that's why the ETH I don't dismiss. When you look at, again, just it's important for us to point this out. When you just look at the numbers,
Hmm.
like how many planets there are orbiting, again, we live in a fairly average place. That's the point, right? Like we went
Right.
from sort of the age where the church ruled the world and humans thought of themselves as the center of the universe, right?
Hmm.
Now, the mainstream science's perspective is that we're a pretty average place, right? That we are an average planet in an average solar system, in an average galaxy. And so when you look at that and you look at just the sheer vastness of space, there's a lot of places that should have life. Like if we believe, as we do, based on our current understanding, that evolution will spring forth and evolve life, that even if it's fairly rare, even if it's extremely rare, that
Hmm.
like intelligent, sophisticated life survives. Again, based on the numbers alone, that should equal plenty of highly civilized, civilizations elsewhere in the cosmos, in the physical universe. I'm not talking about in the multiverse. I'm saying just within our understanding of this physical universe, there should be plenty of room and plenty of opportunity for advanced civilizations to have developed. So, like you say, that brings up the Fermi paradox. So where are they then? And why
Hmm.
haven't they knocked on our door? Kind of thing.
Right.
Brought cookies. So all that is true, and yet with the IDH, again, what happens partly is as our understanding of the complexity of the cosmos and the fabric of reality shifts, so too do our expectations. So it's a combination of the bizarreness we notice, but also what we think the available options are. It's a big difference, but I would just like to point out again that it could very well be an amalgam of the two. There's not this hardline distinction between,
Sure.
are they ultimately ETH? Does that fit better, or does the IDH fit better? It could very well be an amalgam of those two, and it may very well be that within a couple of decades we stop even talking about it in those terms because those kind of collapse into some larger meta category that makes sense of new realities we understand, new relationships with space time we develop. So all of this is inevitably embedded within a cultural context.
Absolutely. And it's hard not to see how the new theories themselves add to the menu of options that are probably there. A phrase that you use quite frequently on Point of Convergence is that the universe is teeming with life, probably. And I think it's easy to see why. Let's just take these two concepts. So if we exist on the Earth, and if we posit that there could be, these interdimensional beings, then right there you already have the ETH, and in this example, we're the extraterrestrials,
Right.
and you have the interdimensional. So it's an additive kind of process where these theories just the circles expand out, and the manifestations of life and sentience or whatever that exists in the universe, they occupy these sort of expanding circular spaces. And so as we stumble across these new theories, it's to me it really does. It's hard not to be compelled to think that there is an abundance of life that exists in a panoply, of ways, that we can't even conceive of. And we've just gotten started. We have just gotten started thinking about our place in this grander scheme. And to come back to the word hubris, the hubris is extreme for us to think like, well, we've already kind of cracked that code. We've already figured this out. I do think it's interesting how, we talk about culture and this interplay between culture and science and theories and our sort of story, how we place ourselves in the world that we find ourselves in popular culture in particular. So we've talked about the multiverse, and it's interesting to me that the multiverse is extremely popular right now. You look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe that is basically taking this concept and has popularized it around the world, and that's not something that just came out of nowhere. Obviously, Marvel had posited this and been playing with this idea for decades in their comics, but it's new to a lot of people. And so the very existence of this idea, the kind of stepping forward of this idea onto the grander stage of our society, is opening up to us the reality of the theory itself, and then and just in waiting in the wings off stage, we have yet other theories that are about to step forward. And so one of those is that we might want to talk about a little bit is the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And I was wondering if you could kind of unpack what that means, and why is that a compelling theory for some people?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And there's a lot of overlap with the interdimensional hypothesis here. And ultra-terrestrials are interesting because that term has been used a few different times by some different key figures. John Keel talked about ultra-terrestrials, I think, originally. Hal Puthoff has also talked about them, but in kind of different ways. And mixed in with there is the crypto-terrestrials that Mac Toney's introduced, which is kind of a play on that as well. The ultra-terrestrial piece sort of in some ways is also an amalgam of the ETH and the IDH in some ways, and taking in the multiverse idea and the many worlds idea, because it's saying that, okay, so maybe it's not an either or. Maybe it's not they're either terrestrial or they're extraterrestrial. Maybe they're ultra-terrestrial, meaning that they are here but not just here, right? And that why would there only be those two options? And again, when we look at the history, and this will be interesting for us to get into too, is the evidence that stretching well back before the 1940s and those initial saucer sightings, if there seems to be evidence of a humanoid kind of species that's here and then not here, and seems to sometimes show either a heightened technological capacity or a heightened consciousness capacity that allows them perhaps to manipulate our perceptions, then people posited perhaps this is an ultra-terrestrial species. Perhaps even at some point, again, there's different ways it's talked about, but one of the proposals is they may even have an evolutionary connection to us, which ties into the whole genetic piece, which we can get into as well. Because again, like you pointed out earlier, we want to always try and make sense of as much of the data as we can. Like when we see consistent trends showing up in the data over and over and over again, that again, even if you account for some witnesses who are not credible, when you look at the body of data over time and that stuff keeps dripping down through your filter, there seems to be something there. Either it's some sort of psychological ploy and you need to analyze that, or it's like on face value something, it's a data point we need to make sense of within these different hypotheses. But yeah, the idea with ultra-terrestrials is that they, again, it's not an either or. They may be here sometimes and sometimes not. They may be connected to the Earth in a very rooted way, perhaps even older than us, perhaps. But they may have capacities that extend beyond ours, either technologically or in terms of their understanding of consciousness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's such a what I like about that theory is the kind of familiarity that it includes. That the sort of family lineage concept of it, that it's almost a bridge to this sort of extreme otherness that may very well exist. It allows us to entertain these notions, and also I think feel that potentially it's within our own reach, right? So if we do share kind of a common ancestor with these ultra-terrestrials, what is it that kind of put us down this other path, and can we get back? Can we do something to take on the qualities that these other sort of genetic siblings have? How do we do that, or what can they teach us? Or but it's also interesting too that the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, I think, and as this is true for all of these theories, quite frankly, it blends into itself these the sort of desires and needs of the culture that we occupy. So it lays onto it. We lay onto it, I should say. This sort of notion that there's a more advanced human civilization. It borrows from these theories of Atlantis and all these megalithic structures. Maybe they're so intertwined with this concept,
right?
And two, their kind of value. The value set of the ultra-terrestrials, you'll often hear to it, where we talk about things like, well, they don't want us to pollute the earth. They don't want us to, fight each other. These are things that, come from our need to really just stop, to stop the violence that we cannot seem to stop amongst ourselves, both against our planet and with each other.
Right. But you raise a really interesting metric to pay attention to there, a really interesting data point. And that is, one of the aspects of the data that lends this hypothesis as a strong contender is that they seem to be really concerned about the Earth. They seem to be concerned about nuclear weapons. They seem to be concerned about us polluting the planet. And you could argue, of course, you can make the argument that if you had a sort of highly conscious ET species that looked at their, sort of, distant cousins spatially and said, "Oh, look, they're at that stage of their civilization where they could destroy themselves. We feel bad for them. Let's step in, like, older brothers and sisters, and help them out." While that's a possibility, when you look at the degree of concern that these others seem to show, as again, getting back to that metric I pointed out earlier, especially since the dawn of the atomic age.
Yep.
Then it's and then again, we need to get into the genetic component, because it certainly seems like it's not hard to postulate. It's logical to say that a species most concerned with what we do to the planet is one that has to cohabitate the planet with us, even if they're only here some of the time, or they kind of like, bilocate between here and some ultra dimension or whatever. If they are, or maybe there's a biosphere that's interdimensional, and that's been part of the narrative, is that when we detonate atomic bombs, again, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around it, and it sounds almost absurd. And some people have rejected it because of that. And some people even tend to the idea that this sounds like deception because they can't wrap their head around it. But one of the narratives is you're doing damage, across the vastness of your solar system and interdimensionally in some sort of extended biome, right? In some shadow biome that we're not aware of, that also gets impacted when we do things like this. And when you look at like just on an atomic level what an atomic bomb is, splitting the fabric of reality, and releasing this massive energy from doing something that doesn't naturally, occur in nature. We're actually saying we're going to take something of the fabric, we're going to smash it apart and release this massive energy. Maybe we don't understand the full implications of that. But it's hard not to be persuaded by the notion that the degree to which they show real concern there, either it's because they're just really selfless and care about others, which is possible.
Yeah. Because
again, as you become more advanced as a species, you tend to have more of a larger sense of collective self, and you become your sphere of concern gets broader and broader. So it would not be just like the Star Trek notion again. It wouldn't be surprising that while they may have a prime directive that says they shouldn't interfere, when they see us, again, on the precipice of self-destruction, maybe that's the one time they sort of cross their fingers and say, we're willing to, break the rule or at least stretch the rules in this one case. But as much as that's a possibility, it's hard to argue with the fact that the species most concerned with what we're doing to the planet would be one, because again, when we had clubs and sticks and stones and even cannons, they didn't seem to show up then so much. Once we started detonating atomic bombs, they did show up. At least you could argue that that's the case. And so that's compelling. What do you think?
Yeah, it makes me think of an analogy like a kid's, like a daycare, right? So you've got a bunch of children and they're at the daycare, they're playing with toys. And most of the time they're playing with the toys and everything's fine, and as the person is taking care of those kids, you're just kind of keeping an eye on them and they're having a great time. But just every toy in that room repurposed could be something very dangerous, so it's the rare times where the children are kind of going off script, so to speak, from play and picking up a toy and using it in a dangerous way. And it's at that moment where that caretaker steps in and takes the toy away, or changes the way the play is structured, kind of brings it back to the narrative that is what it would be expected. Play within the rules, right? And so it's a good fit, I think, sort of description of the kind of that mature consciousness, sort of being present with the less sort of aware or emerging conscious beings, and taking action appropriately without overly acting. It's not like they're taking away all the toys. Like let's remove all the toys now because this one kid decided to use a block and was going to bludgeon their fellow friend with that. So I think it fits the story pretty well.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because we've been talking a lot about cultural context, and part of the reason why I think that the IDH and the idea of ultra-terrestrials became more paramount as well is because as we learned more about the world, we had mapped out more and more territory. It became increasingly a stretch to imagine there could be a sister humanoid species like hiding away somewhere in our physical plane. Mm-hmm. Some people still like that idea, and that's, again, more of the crypto-terrestrial idea that maybe, even where we live in, Appalachia, there's sort of this notion of these cave-dwelling kind of beings that show up like, the Kentucky goblins and stuff. And people think that maybe those are related to the ancient fairies from Europe, and that these are actually beings that, do live in caves and come out once in a while and, kind of play games with us. But generally in the society, that's become less and less of a possibility in people's minds, that, there's just seems unlikely to people. So then we postulate, okay, as our notion of what constitutes reality is expanded, we go, well, maybe they're there in this other place then, they're in this parallel reality. That begins to make sense. So it's interesting how, again, it's a combination of kind of like Santa Claus, right? You grow up and you start putting two and two together, and you look at like, either you don't even have a chimney, or your chimney is so narrow that you go, how does it get down? And so over time you go, I'm not sure that the Santa Claus hypothesis makes a lot of sense as it's postulated. So, and you shift your perspective based on your growing knowledge of the world. Same idea here, that these notions we propose are inevitably a combination of what feels like the best fit based on what we understand and what new aspects are coming online that allow us to think about new possibilities.
Absolutely. Well, after kind of unpacking all those things, what are some, and I know you're particularly good at doing this, so what are the things that are bubbling up to you that these three concepts seem to either have in common, or is there anything that might be a meta characteristic of these things that emerges and might be a better fit for what's happening here?
It's really interesting you brought that up, and that's because I would say when I'm honest with myself and I look back at my history studying this, I would say I've shifted a few times. There was a time where the ETH, partly the reason why that diminished in my mind as a possibility was because of, for instance, the genetic aspect, the hybridization aspect, the weird sexual encounters. Mm. All of those elements seem to me to make more sense for a species that's somehow biologically connected to us, even if it's in the distant past, an early sort of ancestor of ours or something, or we shared an ancestor at some point. Mm-hmm. That this idea that, perhaps they're genetically impoverished or whatever, that the idea that if they interbred too much and maybe because of our expanding conquest of the globe, they had to, dwell in smaller and smaller places, and maybe because of the changing environment didn't do so well, they're not flourishing. And so, but they have some capacities beyond us technologically or in terms of consciousness. So MacTony's, in his book, The Cryptoterrestrials, proposed that maybe they're, on the one hand, they're ahead of us, but on the other hand, they need us. That maybe for their DNA, maybe they just need to inject fresh stock. Because we know this is true. If you have any culture that is too interbred, eventually you'll end up with defects, Mm-hmm. We know that happens in a family. But even, I found this very interesting to learn this recently, even when discussing the future human hypothesis, that even amongst millions, eventually you'll run into those same problems where you'll get defects because there's not enough novel DNA going into the mix kind of thing, even amongst a really large population. So again, the idea is because we see making sense of all the data as much as we can, knowing that there's this sexual component, again, as I mentioned recently in a podcast, whether it's like, a cold machine kind of extracting sperm or eggs, or there seems to be like a setup where a kind of actual sexual encounter happens with a humanoid or human looking being. Mm-hmm. And then really crazy stories like, this being will then like touch their tummy and point up like, Yahoo, that worked. Hybrid on the way. Really weird things like that. And then, human beings later being introduced to what seem like hybrid beings, as far as they can tell. I mean, it could be a ruse, but they're holding in their hands what seems like an organic biological being that looks half alien, half human. And on top of that, seems to show their biological, physiological traits to make them really believe that this is their offspring. Again, you could say this is all some sort of ploy, and it's some sort of psyop, but they believe that anyway. So then you have to ask yourself, how do you make sense of that? So that's what I'm getting at is initially that made me lean away from the ETH. And I thought, okay, ultra-terrestrial, maybe crypto-terrestrial, some combination of the two made more sense. But then I came across notions like, convergent evolution, which is this notion that actually just as the periodic table is, everywhere in the cosmos, it's not just here. And the same, elements and processes that form the Earth and the Sun are happening across the cosmos. And that it makes sense that evolution is a sort of cosmic response that's sort of built into nature across the board. That if you, that maybe the idea with convergent evolution is that something like a humanoid bipedal figure might be a common way that nature responds to a variety of environments, that for a variety of reasons, it's just a good, set of attributes to end up with. Yeah. And when that happens, you you suddenly opens up the ETH again. You say, well, maybe it's not as simple as they look too much like us, so they can't be from here. Add in, and then I'm going to flip it over to you to give your thoughts on the mix of these three. But when you add in also the notion that, again, because like I said last week, we have so few baselines. What if there was some sort of cosmic seeding program that happened, in ancient history,
Yep.
across the cosmos? Then that could also explain for why you have these humanoid figures that seem to pop up in numerous places. And we shouldn't just assume that if they're human looking or humanoid-ish, that they're from here. It may be that we're, again, this is sort of the egoic response gets, struck down. The notion of being at the top of the chain, the big dog gets struck down for us. What if we're just one of many iterations of a humanoid seeding that happened across the cosmos? And that could also make sense of that. So you start suddenly going, wait a second, there's lots of ways I can make sense of this data. And then it becomes which one is your favorite, and then being honest with yourself about why maybe that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, where you landed is where I was going to jump in. So I love that because, I agree. And I keep coming back to this notion that, what if, humans and humanoid beings are really very prevalent? What if they're everywhere? And that were sort of placed here, as you mentioned, a long time ago, and we just happen to believe that we emerged here when we really didn't. And that would explain and kind of better fit many of the data points that we seem to hear about. But looking at it from a kind of a very high level view as well, with these three theories and many of the others too, the thing that kind of jumps out at me is the ability to interact with it. Right. So the way that we can interface with the beings in a modality that is, pretty familiar to us, right? It's not like we're talking about even the movie Arrival, which people like to use as a good example of, something totally other that we can't really relate to. Like we eventually do. We do eventually figure this out, and she kind of cracks the code and can communicate with them. And so, the big takeaway for me from the three hypotheses is that whatever the others happen to be, we at least have the sense in which we can actually interact with them. We can have a meaningful exchange of information and experience with them. And that says something in and of itself, right? Because, I don't know about you, and I'm not multilingual, but if I'm speaking with someone, who is, and they're not speaking English, I'm gonna have a hard time understanding them. I can understand, the kind of context cues and the nonverbal communication, but I don't really know exactly what they're saying to me. But most of these stories, like you'd read them and it's like, well, yeah, we had meaningful exchange. It was through a picture, a telepathic exchange, but even a telepathic exchange assumes a common sort of substrate of reality that we would share, which, I mean, to me is a big jump. It's a big assumption to make. And so, that opens up a lot of notions about sort of how long the others may, have been interacting with us. Maybe they've, kind of learned as they went, just like you and I would learn if we went to another country and we had to live there for a long time. We'd pick up the language eventually. We might not be native speakers, but be pretty good. And that kind of might explain some of the data that we hear about where they seem to can interact, but it's a little bit weird, not in a very familiar way or intimately familiar way. And so, for me, it's what fascinates me about these stories is kind of ultimately the actual humanness of them, and what that says about our ability to either completely anthropomorphize what is going on, and in that process totally misinterpret what's actually going on, or we do have some sort of shared or sentience or whatever has a shared sort of language that transcends these kind of cultural species specific parameters.
Yeah, great points. I think one of the big questions is around how much can we say is a cosmic constant when it comes to sentient life? how much is it reasonable for us to expect that they would be similar enough to us that we could have any kind of communication that's meaningful? To what degree is it sensical that their relationship to space-time would be similar enough that we, like in the movie Arrival, can even think about reality in the same ways? Part of going to a different culture, you mentioned different languages, and I kind of speak a couple of them, not super well, but I try. But I've been to different parts of the world and lived in different places. And in addition to the language issue, there's just a different cultural context, right? The different cultural expectations, so much stuff that you just don't have to give thought to here because it's in the backdrop. We grow up with it. But you go to some other continent and suddenly you're like, whoa, you don't do that, You go to some countries and you don't shake with a certain hand. You don't shake hands with a certain hand because that hand's supposed to do something else, And we don't think about that here, right? It's just not in the milieu. But the idea of, again, the cosmic seeding program is kind of the X factor because that would explain why it's not necessarily, a humanocentric way of thinking about reality and others. But something I wonder about a lot is that, and this, again, inevitably at some point, you have to postulate something. You have to begin with some givens. We talked about this before we went on this podcast tonight, that when you're making any kind of model of reality or model of existence, model of sentient life, you have to begin somewhere, right? And so one way you can begin is with consciousness. And there's increasing evidence that this may be the way that reality is structured, that actually consciousness is primary. And from that, you get these epiphenomena like matter and energy and whatnot. But if that's the case, then it may be that all conscious life goes through a predictable, strata of learning and evolution, that consciousness evolves as well as biology. So, we look at human populations, and I think I discussed this last time. I've certainly discussed it on Point of Convergence, that what's really fascinating with models like spiral dynamics is that you find across various cultures around the world, there's a predictable kind of march of progress that happens. You notice this both with individual human beings, that as we grow and evolve from infants to children to adults, we follow very predictable steps along the way. And so too do entire cultures. Civilizations also follow these various steps. Not all in one go. Of course, even within American culture, we kind of are an amalgam of several different, large components of developmental levels. But the question is, one of the key questions is, in this subject matter in general, is to what degree is it fair to apply that across the cosmos or even across the multiverse, if that's what reality is? That consciousness has some sort of ultimate starting place, which makes it predictable, actually, that you would go through sort of similar steps, and that there would be common ground, therefore, even amongst species that are interacting from vast distances across our physical universe or interdimensionally or whatever, that that consciousness, that connection, that sort of non-dual oneness, that's sort of the substrate to all of reality, that common ground, that common starting place, right, that entangles all of us, allows for that communication. I think, like you say, not only the fact that we can telepathically communicate with them, and both ways, right? It's not just them sending thoughts to us, but we can send thoughts to them, but that it's meaningful at all. That we, some people even argue, Ken Wilber's argued, that it's a miracle even that any two human beings can understand each other. Right. I trust that my vision of green is the same as yours. We're talking about the same sort of thing, let alone what a palm tree is, or what an ant is, or what a backache feels like. All these things are little miracles that you realize we are even able to communicate with each other this way. And this may be something just, core to reality, is that there's this common ground that this allows for this communication. Regardless of how you want to look at it, the data certainly seems to suggest that communication can and does happen. So maybe that makes you lean towards some connection to the Earth, even if it's an alternate Earth, or you say, no, there's some sort of common cosmic constants to consciousness, and that's why they may be coming from some other galaxy, and I can still talk to them, understand them, and they understand me. Like you say, it can be jilted, right? The conversation isn't as smooth as it is for the two of us, just like it wouldn't be as smooth for us to talk to someone from some other continent, right? We'd have to get past language and cultural context. But the fact that it happens at all, and it does, according to the literature. So we have to make sense of that no matter how we look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating conversation to me to think about these things, and one thing that came to mind as you were talking about the sort of the commonality of consciousness that whereas the mind may not be kind of the epiphenomenon of the brain, but matter may be an epiphenomenon of consciousness. It reminded me of theory of mind. With the emergence of identity in children, and how when we're people that are studying that concept, very much look at it from that angle of, well, this is a developmental stage. They're young, and so as they mature, they're able to, their brains mature as well, and the brain reaches a state where the mind, the sense of self, the sense of understanding what other selves may do, that emerges. But we may have that backwards entirely. It may be that that's not what's happening. That it's really there, kind of at the base level. But as we mature, the way in which we sort of manifest that consciousness kind of changes. Anyway, just a lot of stuff to think about here with these three pretty basic ways of thinking about the phenomenon that you can easily see how just taking them and then trying to incorporate them and come up with some better fit hypotheses, you often are easily landing either on like it's all of them, or it's even more than this. So it to me that's exciting and invigorating to think about where we might be as we move forward in our study of what the phenomenon happens to be. But as we kind of transition toward the end of the show, I wanted to, kind of give a nod to some of our listeners. I know we received a few questions from folks who were enjoying the show, and one in particular that I think we wanted to talk about as we conclude, and that was, I think it came from Slide 9 on Twitter, and that they had asked, kind of how the study of the phenomenon has impacted us personally. And I was wondering, Exo, if you would want to touch on that. Obviously, that's a pretty big question, and it could probably take easily another hour or so. But what are some ways in which this has impacted you on a personal level?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like you say, there's so many directions you can go. I think that one aspect that jumps out to any of us who are really, invested in this. Any of us who are invested in this recognize that it becomes an obsession, and that in itself is fascinating. It's not like one of several, pastimes that we're somewhat interested in, and we check in once in a while. I mean, when I look at the amount of time and energy I dedicate to this topic alone, it's amazing to me. And I've even heard about people, on UFO Twitter, kind of jokingly, but being serious at the same time, saying they tried to quit it, and the withdrawal symptoms were too intense. It's almost like a physical withdrawal symptom. So that in itself is fascinating, because that, of course, prompts the question: why is that the case? Is it just that we're curious people, and this is the most curious topic? I think there's something to that. I think something that blows the minds of many of us who are really invested in this and aware of the data, how much data there is why it's not getting more play in the mainstream. That is shocking to us. So that's something that impacts us personally. Is to feel like you don't want to feel like you're part of a cult, but we are a part of a subset of society that is not just somewhat, but fully invested in this topic. And so it creates an interesting sense of community and a sense of, you kind of feel like you're in the Matrix and everyone else doesn't realize it, or a lot of people don't, kind of thing, that kind of idea. I think for me, part of the reason why it's so, I'm so obsessive about it is because it's tied very much to my questions around ultimate meaning and
Mm.
the very fabric of reality. Why are we here? How did we get here? Where are we going? How are we connected to everything else? Is there a purpose? All of those questions end up overlapping with the UFO phenomenon and high strangeness,
Mm.
not just because there's some overlap naturally, but you even get really bizarre elements of data like deceased relatives showing up with gray aliens, so or people who are contactees, when they're in the presence of these others, suddenly remembering previous lifetimes or in between spaces between lifetimes when they knew these others.
Mm.
Even people who have memories of being a gray alien, either in a previous or parallel kind of reality. So it definitely overlaps with all of the big questions. And I've always been personally invested in those questions. I've always been the one. My mom even kind of jokes, I just seemed kind of detached in some ways socially, because I was always looking up at the stars and trying to make sense of what was reality, why are we here, kind of thing, and not interested in small talk kind of thing.
Mm.
I think too, for me, we can maybe get into it in a future podcast, but I've talked about it on Point of Convergence and in a couple of different interviews. Had my own personal experience with my wife. It happened in 2005, an encounter with a humanoid entity that was one of those ontologically shocking personal experiences that you can't initially make sense of. I feel closer now to understanding it than I ever have before because of some recent revelations. But nevertheless, when something like that happens, that shakes your very core understandings of what reality is and what's supposed to happen. Is this
Mm.
real life, so to speak? It becomes personal. And so many of the people that you encounter on UFO Twitter and whatnot, some people end up there because they've heard talk on news shows about UFOs and they think, well, that's cool tech, I want to learn about that. But a lot of people show up because they've had these anomalous experiences personally, and you can't help but be changed by it. You grapple for meaning. So for me, that's been a big part of it too. So it's an overlap of it. It touches on all of the big questions. I've had my own anomalous experiences that I'm trying to make sense of, and I really do believe that it's the most interesting question of our time, if not all of time.
Mm.
And why wouldn't we be asking this? But what about you? What about for you? What's your personal experience with this when you interact with it?
For me, it has kind of re-enchanted the world. I grew up in a pretty kind of religious, environment, a progressively religious one. So a lot of all topics are kind of on the table. And I was encouraged to study, a variety of things and look at things from a very academic perspective. Kind of hinting at what you talked about. The search for ultimate meaning was a pretty common topic in my house growing up. What does it all mean, and what are we here for? What is our purpose? And looking at the ways in which communities of people, both individuals and communities, grapple with that challenge. So when looking at it from the lens of religion, it was it didn't take too long for me to see that was a sort of a narrative layer that was applied to the human experience, and it was a kind of a software, if you will, that communities of believers, sort of all were running the same version of that software. And as long as you were, kind of using the same, version and doing the things in a similar way, it provided and enhanced and solidified that ultimate meaning for that community of believers. Right. So, but as I grew up and studied religion further, I kind of came to a place that a lot of people often do, that where I could really I couldn't see the religion without seeing that layer, without being distracted, quite frankly, by that layer. So I was no longer then part of the community itself. I was then on the outside looking in at it. And that just completely destroyed the sort of mystical, enchanting, powerful qualities, quite frankly, of of that entire operating belief system. And so then I basically kind of swung the other direction to a very hard materialist viewpoint, and had that viewpoint for many, many years. But this topic in particular, even though I've not had an experience that most people would be able to point to and say, he's experienced the phenomenon. My experience of the phenomenon is the study of it itself, right? So the observation of it itself. While I may not know what it is, I like to observe and examine what it seems to be doing. So it's also kind of playing with the ways in which these ideas and concepts change human behavior. So there are those who, in the scientific world, who are studying the way things are, and if you're an economist, you're kind of trying to find out what is the best economic system for this particular situation, maximizing these certain variables. For me, it's not looking at that. It's looking at almost like what fascinates me are the things that lay below all of that, that the strange things in human experience that many of us have throughout our lives that we just kind of like sweep into the corner of the kitchen and we don't really think too much about, but they actually do impact the way in which we live. And that is what fascinates me and what drives me. So this topic is allowing me to look at the world again through these sort of fresh lenses and to say, hey, I don't know everything and we don't know everything. And there is so much more to all of this than we perceive. And that, while I think at times can be quite daunting, there are certainly moments where I do want to walk away from it because it's like, I'd rather just pay the bills. I'd rather not have to think about this. I'd rather just do the things that, get me from point A to point B. On the other hand, it's a compulsion, as you sort of say. It's something that I feel I am uniquely suited for. I have been given a set of tools to use that allow me to look at this and I think tease out from that observation some helpful conclusions, not just for myself, but for others as well. Because I do have a strong sort of love, as you know, I'm a big tent kind of person. I have a strong love for people, and I really do want to see how we can, as a people, kind of come to a place of better understanding that ideally brings us closer to an understanding of who we are as individuals, but who we are with each other.
Yeah, great points. And what you said there made me think about the fact that what's interesting is, again, for the general public, there's often this disconnect between notions like religion and spirituality and how they make sense of their life and their purpose. And then UFOs and ETs just seem like a completely different topic. Mm-hmm. But for people like you and I who have a divinity and biblical studies background, we look at this and we look at encounters that happened in ancient human history, and we go, and at one point in our life, like you said, when you were kind of a flatland materialist, you might have just rejected those notions and said, these are people just making up stories to figure out why their crops burned or whatever. Mm-hmm. But because of a greater understanding, it reinvigorates those discussions too, and says, wait a second. Despite what, flatland modernists want to claim, maybe they really were encountering something and they weren't just like on ayahuasca or something and imagined a burning bush. Maybe they really did encounter beings. And like I said last time, are wrestling with what it means and how to make sense of it and how they're supposed to respond because of that, And so all of that gets wrapped up together, that this is not just about the future and how we may have a relationship or not with these others, but our very history, who we are, the sudden leap in our capacity evolutionarily, in 30,000 years ago or whatever, like even mainstream science has a hard time understanding why there was a sudden leap. It looks almost like an attuning happened, an enhancement, right? Mm. Who would that be, So it partly bridges together different categories, like the spiritual with something like extraterrestrial or interdimensional. In other words, for a long time, fairy lore was considered kind of silly and those pure, those poor pre-scientific people, right? Mm-hmm. And then suddenly when we have interdimensional understandings and the idea of ultra-terrestrials, and suddenly that comes back in the picture. And that's partly what Vallée did, right? It was like saying, wait a second, there's a lot of overlap between these creatures now and how they appear and what they do with fairy lore. What if it's been happening all along, and we just have had different categories to understand it. So again, getting back to the name of the show, the way we frame these realities is so interesting, and it's interesting to see in real time how we respond to that as individuals and as a people.
Absolutely. Well, this is getting us to the end of our episode, and we do want to keep this conversation going, and we hope that you'll engage with us wherever you find our show, either on YouTube, at the ExoAcademian YouTube channel, or on your podcast of choice. You can find us there under Liminal Frames. You can reach out to us and connect with us through our Twitter handles. The show handle is at Liminal Frames. ExoAcademian is at ExoAcademian, and I am reachable at a waif soul. And we also have other shows as well. So if you like the things that you've heard and want to engage with us on those platforms, you can check out ExoAcademian and his excellent podcast, The Point of Convergence. And then you can find me with my crew at the Calling All Beings channel on YouTube and on the podcast of your choice. So with that being said, we will close out episode 2 and look forward to where this conversation will take us. And so may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits.